Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samuetti. With me today, of course, is co-founder of the Gaggle, Peter Lavelle, and we're once again very fortunate to be joined by a regular guest on the Gaggle, military analyst, intelligence, former intelligence official, Scott Ritter. So welcome, Scott. Since we last spoke, maybe a couple of months ago, there have been a number of developments, and obviously it'd be very good to get your take. In the last few days, we had obviously the embarrassing and painful episode of some 90 Russian servicemen being killed. According to the Russian Ministry of Defense, the cause was that they were using their cell phones, which of course gave away their location, and that was the reason for their targeting. But however, that may not be militarily significant. I mean, it's obviously painful and embarrassing for the Russian government, but militarily it may not be significant. So, what's your take about what's going on and what the future prospects look like?
And maybe, to kind of bookend it, peak Zelenskyy appearing in front of Congress. I think those two are the biggest events that we have seen since we last spoke.
Well, let me start then. My brain works chronologically, so I'll start with Zelenskyy because I think it's a good setup for this. Why did Zelenskyy go to Congress? It's a key question. Was it to deliver, as Nancy Pelosi said, the greatest speech in the history of Congress? The greatest speech. I mean, we've never seen anything like the Zelenskyy speech, except today nobody can remember a single word that he said because it was totally irrelevant. It mattered not. In fact, it's a speech I think he'd rather forget because it exposed the fact that Zelenskyy is purely a figurehead. He's a toy. He's a chess piece being moved on a board. Zelenskyy went to Washington as political cover for a vote being carried out by a lame duck session of Congress. For I think between was it 43 or 63 billion? It doesn't matter if you get up to that number. It's a billion here or there, but it's a lot of money to be allocated for Ukraine. Money that may not have been passed so freely and willingly or without question by the new Congress that had emerged from this, although the Republicans seem to be having a heck of a time appointing a speaker, but that's a different issue altogether. But Zelenskyy was brought in purely for political cover. But sometimes the actors forget their roles and they think they're actually players. And Zelenskyy came in, I think, under the misguided perception that because he got to meet with Joe Biden in a made-for-Hollywood moment in the White House where he got to hand him a medal that was given to him from a hero of Bakhmut, whom Zelenskyy met with the day before he got on a U.S. Air Force plane to fly to Washington, D.C., or to hand a flag to Nancy Pelosi signed by the heroes of Bakhmut. He thought maybe, gosh, I am somebody. And instead of just Pinocchio, the wooden boy being manipulated, he thought he was actually a real boy. No, Zelenskyy, you're not a real boy. You're just a little puppet. And here's the proof. You see, prior to Zelenskyy's trip, there was a meeting held by The Economist where General Zelenskyy, the commander of the Ukrainian armed forces, was front and center. I think present at the meeting was Zelenskyy, who didn't say a word, which speaks volume. And Zelenskyy was asked, what his feeling was on the battlefield. He said, I can beat these guys being the Russians. Well, Zelenskyy, you can't because you haven't and you're not going to, but it's all right. You're allowed to think what you want. I can beat these guys. But to do it, he said, I need 300 tanks, 500 armored fighting vehicles, 500 artillery pieces, and unlimited ammunition. I mean, it is literally a scene from the movie of Downfall with Adolf Hitler down in the bunker looking at a map. Where's Vink? Where's Steiner? If the Ninth Army only did this, they'd do this, we'd win the war. Well, the armies don't exist, Hitler. And guess what, Zelenskyy? The armies don't exist. The equipment isn't coming. You're not going to get it. And he knows it. He said so. He said, if you don't give me the stuff, then I ain't going to win. I'm going to lose because the Russians are actually pretty good. And they're building up a lot of forces that are going to be able to fight, and we don't have anything to stop them. So that's the mindset that Zelensky's coming into. I can't stop. And then meanwhile, the Russians are pounding the living dog doo-doo out of the Ukrainian infrastructure with missiles that supposedly aren't supposed to exist, drones that apparently get shot down at 110% success rate, but still somehow manage to fall on the target they intended to strike. $1 trillion in infrastructure damage has been done to Ukraine, much of it more recently through these strikes on their electrical generation capacity and others. The Ukrainian society is shutting down, and that's the other reality. So Zelensky wants air defense, and he needs magical armies to appear. So he comes to Washington, D.C., and he's supposed to just play a script, show up, hand the medal, hand the flag, give the greatest speech in the history of Congress, and then leave. Gosh, but he tries to ask for more. He wants not one Patriot missile battery, but 2. He wants tanks. He wants this. And he was told, no, you're not going to get it. And that says a whole bunch right there. It says that the West isn't trying to win this war. The West has given up on winning this war. The West simply wants to do what Lindsey Graham has, articulated in one of his only honest moments, have Ukraine fight to the last Ukrainian. Yeah. And that's the sad fate of Ukraine right now. So now we come to the current situation. Russia's in the midst of finalizing its...
Well, Scott, if I could just finish up with the Zelensky visit before we move forward. I agree with your analysis. I think it was also just to continue the grift while they had it, because we had the unprecedented boondoggle bill passed in the lame duck Congress, which it satisfied the defense industries, the Pentagon, and the Ukraine coalition, if we want to call that. But I mean, if you're right, and I think you are, you have a good road record here. Are they setting Zelensky up as the fall guy? We did everything we could. We did.
There's no doubt about it. I mean, I can't pretend to be an expert on Ukrainian politics. Like everybody, I watched from a distance. The election between Poroshenko and Zelensky. I was confused about the relationship between democracy and oligarchs, and how that worked. But I shouldn't, because I'm an American and money dominates American politics. So it just dominates Ukrainian politics in a different manner.
No, in the U.S., there's lobbying, there's corruption in Ukraine. Okay,
there is corruption in Ukraine, but since the war, I've been watching as Zelensky has, because a lot of people don't realize, while he may have won the election in 2019, I believe it was, with 78% of the support. By the time the war broke out, some polls say his support rating was 23% and dropping. He had shut down all opposition. He had become a virtual dictator. He was confused. He had bad policies. So this war comes along, and this horribly unpopular man is now Winston Churchill. But he's only Churchill because we invented him. Zelensky didn't invent himself. His famous quote, "I don't need a ride, I need ammunition." He never said it. It was written by a CIA operative in the U.S. Embassy, and the U.S. Embassy has admitted it. They come right out and said, "No, he didn't say that."
Well, one of his claim to fame is he has a peculiar way of playing the piano. I don't want to say anything more. Okay.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, look, it's a talent. But we'll leave it at that. The fact is, though, this is a man who has been propped up by the West, and who's only he's not a military genius. He's not a military tactician. He's not a leader. He's not an able politician. His speeches are written by others. Everything he does, he's a puppet. And his sole purpose for existing has been to serve as the focal point for the creation of a myth worthy of Western support. And so that's his job. But we've seen since late summer, early fall, this trend, at least I've been tracking this trend in the Western media, where they're starting to put the focus on the defense minister in Ukraine There was a great, not a great, but it was a big story in the New Yorker magazine that seemed to have the stamp of approval from the National Security Advisor, because a lot of people were talking about a lot of highly classified things that normally would get you put in jail for discussing openly in the media. But there it was, and it seemed to start to de-emphasize the Zelenskyy effect and start to talk about the Ministry of Defense. And now Zelenskyy is emerging as a competitor. And Klitschko, the mayor of Kiev, is starting to emerge. The wolves are starting to circle the corpse that is Zelenskyy. And I do believe he is being set up as the fall guy. So, and one of the purposes of this trip was for the United States to say, we did everything possible. We gave him all the support. It's not our fault that these bad things are happening to the Ukrainians.
But with a view to what? I mean, I've heard these arguments, oh, DM, they're going to do him to DM. But the reason they got rid of DM was they didn't think DM wanted to go on fighting. They thought DM was going to do some kind of an agreement with Ho Chi Minh. And the Americans didn't want that. The Americans wanted to take over the war, which is what happened. Once the DM was out, the Americans took over the war. So, you know, if they do push Zelenskyy out, that would be with a view to what? I mean, what would be the American goal in getting rid of Zelenskyy?
American goal in getting rid of Zelenskyy is to bring this war to a rapid closure.
Why would the Americans want to do that? That would be a change in policy, because the Americans think this war is going pretty well. You know, I mean, it's relatively inexpensive for the Americans, not for the Europeans, but for the Americans, it's relatively expensive, and it's painful for the Russians. Why would the Americans want to bring it to an end?
Nobody in America wants this war to continue, because some things are about to happen. Russia's about to go on the offensive, and this is what we're going to get into when we talked about the 96 dead, probably more once they pull all the bodies out. In School 19, let's focus on some realities. Let's just be clear right now. If Biden wanted Zelenskyy to win, he'd have sent not 2 Patriot batteries, but 5 Patriot batteries, and they would have been sent months ago. If we wanted Zelenskyy to win, if Biden wanted Zelenskyy to win, we'd be twisting the arm of Germany to provide Leopard tanks. There would be tens of thousands of Ukrainian forces at Grafenwohr right now in Germany being trained on advanced armored fighting techniques using the most advanced NATO equipment possible to get them on the battlefield to engage the Russians decisively if we wanted them to win. We tried that. And yeah, it succeeded in Kharkov being recaptured. It succeeded in the right bank of Kherson, Kherson being recaptured. But that's it. Now they're all dead. Now all the equipment's gone. As Zelenskyy said, I need 300 tanks. I need 500 armored fighting vehicles. I need 500 artillery pieces. Why do you need those? We already gave them to you. Oh, everything we gave you is gone. You blew it. You had your little Pyrrhic victory. You got to have a headline for a day. Zelenskyy got to walk through Izium and go, hey, I'm the liberator of Izium. He got to take a selfie in Kherson. Well, I'm here to tell you right now that Izium and Kherson are going to belong to Russia in the not so distant future. Why? It's simple military math. It's called burn rate and replenishment rate. The Ukrainian burn rate is unreal. They are burning through manpower and equipment at unsustainable rates. Bakhmut has been called the meat grinder for a reason. Ukrainian forces are going in there. They're suffering 80-90% casualties before being rotated out with a new unit coming in. Now, that doesn't mean that the Russians aren't suffering casualties. They are, but not on a level. The burn rate for the Ukrainians is gigantic. The burn rate for Russia, not so much. The replenishment rate, because if you have a large burn rate, you need an even larger replenishment rate. But the Ukrainian replenishment rate is smaller than their burn rate, meaning they're burning through men and equipment at a rate more accelerated than what can be replaced. You know, if your burn rate is say 800 men a day, and you in 10 days you lose 8,000. That's 10 days. And if NATO says we can train 8,000 troops in 3 months, George, I'm not a mathematician, but I'll tell you right now, that's an equation that will never balance out. And that's the fact. NATO can't train Ukrainian troops quick enough to replace the casualties on the battlefield. And NATO has already shown, in the United States, demonstrated that they don't have the equipment, or they're unwilling to give the equipment to Ukrainians to replace that which has been destroyed. Meanwhile, Russia still hasn't finished its mobilization of 300,000. The final 125, 150,000 or so are finishing the final touches on their combat preparations, where they have been organized into combat units. The reservists that made their way, these were battlefield replacements. They went in, they beefed up the defensive lines, they've solidified, and look at the stability all along on the line right now. There's no major Ukrainian breakthroughs. The Ukrainians are beating their head against a brick wall. The Russians are stabilized.
Let me interrupt you here for a second. First of all, for our viewers, Scott froze up there a little bit, but the audio was fine, as you just noticed there. Okay, let's talk about this offensive. You've talked about this before. Douglas McGregor has talked about it in a very lengthy conversation with Michael Vlahos. I think a lot of our viewers saw that. It was quite interesting in many ways. I tend to agree with you. I mean, living here, that there's talk about the upcoming offensive, nothing specific. There's no leakage out of the Kremlin, I can guarantee you that. They don't have problems with leaks. But if and when, and I think it's more when anything, a major offensive start, and Ukraine begins to crumble and crumble quickly, can NATO survive that? I mean, they put in so much. I mean, because the way I've looked at this and tried to frame it over the last few months, maybe the last 6 months, is that I really buy into this is NATO against Russia. And when there is a termination of hostilities, NATO loses, not Ukraine, NATO. And I think this has been part of the Russian plan. I mean, it explains how Russia has been fighting this conflict. But what do you think NATO's response going to be? I mean, they're all in on this, okay? And from a propaganda point of view, in the U.S. as well, I understand what George's concerns are here. But let's talk about this offensive and its implications, because this will be, the way I look at it, a complete, utter, humiliating defeat for NATO.
Well, it's going to be, but one of the things we can say about the Russians is, I mean, there's an old saying, and I might be getting it wrong, but the Russian is slow to harness but quick to ride. It takes a while for the Russians to get into the harness, to get settled in, etc. And that's pretty much been this war. Allow me for a second just to back up and frame, from my perspective, this war. When February 24th occurred, I think we were all not taken aback, but this was something that it was new.
Numb. We were all numb.
And everybody's just going, wow, boom. And some immediate narratives came out. And one of the narratives was that this was a precipitous, unprovoked war of aggression on the part of Russia. And that this was about Russia seeking to dramatically resolve the Ukrainian problem once and for all, decisively, etc. But we now know a couple things. Let me just, again, give me a moment, because this is important. This is really important. We knew, but we didn't know how to put it in proper perspective, about William Burns' memorandum in early 2008, Niet means Niet, where William Burns said, hey, this idea of bringing Ukraine into NATO is a red line, and if it's crossed, it will probably lead to Russian military intervention in Ukraine. I mean, we knew that. So we knew cause and effect right off from the start. When the U.S. ambassador writes a memorandum like this, you can't say we didn't know. We knew that if we invited Ukraine in to NATO, we were crossing a red line that eventually would lead to a Russian military intervention in Ukraine. We knew that, and yet we invited Ukraine in that November. So right off the bat, you have to understand that we were seeking a military confrontation in Ukraine with Russia from the very beginning, even pre-2014. Now we come to 2014. All right, the coup. Well, I view it as a coup. People can view it any way they want. Bottom line is, the constitutionally elected government of Yanukovych is out, and this new revolutionary nationalistic government is in. And a fighting breaks out in Donbass. In August of 2014, the fighting was not going well for the Ukrainian army. I think people tend to forget that thousands of them had been surrounded in a village in Donetsk, and were facing imminent destruction, death and destruction. It was going to be the end of the Ukrainian army. And so the Ukrainian government begged for a solution. And the Germans and the French came up, formed something called the Normandy format, because remember, we had this anniversary of the Normandy landing, and the Germans and the French and the Russians got together and said, hey, why don't we try and fix what's going on in Donbass? And so through the more Normandy format, they came up with the Minsk Accords. And it was supposed to be about peace, ceasefire, creating stability, so that there could be a peaceful outcome that kept Donbass within the territorial integrity of a sovereign Ukraine. That was the goal of the Minsk Accords, according to Petro Poroshenko, according to Angela Merkel, and according to, well, I'm going to get to that, and according to Hollande, the French president. And Putin bought into it. He said, okay, if this is what you want, this is what we want. We come up to February 24th, and Minsk has collapsed, apparently. But it's Russia's fault. That's what we're told. The Russians are to blame. But for whatever reason, Poroshenko, Merkel, and Hollande have all come out and said, nah, Minsk was always a sham, never to be taken seriously. The sole purpose of Minsk was to buy time so that the Ukrainian military, which was being humiliated on the battlefield in Donetsk at the time of the Minsk Accords, could regroup, be retrained by NATO so that they could solve this problem militarily. The Minsk Accords was promotion of war, the same way that the invitation of Ukraine into NATO was the promotion of war. We know this by the Burns Memorandum. We know this now by the confessions of Poroshenko, Merkel, and Hollande. We know that the West was promoting war. It wasn't just theoretical, because the U.S. built a training facility in Western Ukraine in 2015 that trained 500, or we'll call it a battalion of Ukrainian soldiers every 55 days. Nearly 30,000 Ukrainian soldiers passed through that training facility prior to the conflict in 2022. Guys, this wasn't a precipitous Russian action. This was an act of desperate self-defense by Russia confronting this. And this is so important to recognize, because now that we recognize this, it suddenly puts into perspective. Russia was seeking, bending over backwards, a diplomatic resolution. They were begging for Minsk to be implemented. Putin told Biden, if you want to stop what's going on, and when they met in Geneva 2021, implement Minsk. Biden promised, but he lied, because they all lied about it. The Russians, in a final act of diplomatic desperation, put forward draft treaties about a new security framework in Europe that would take Ukraine out of NATO, but resolve this. There would be no fighting, and they were turned down. We didn't trade them seriously, but we said it was the Russians being aggressive with diplomacy. No, the Russians were desperate for peace. And here's the final proof of that. They invade Ukraine, but they don't invade Ukraine. The special military operation was not an invasion. If it was an invasion, we wouldn't be talking about it today, because it would have been over. But the Russians went in soft, went in gentle. We couldn't understand why they did it. Why? Because they didn't want to go to war. They didn't want to go to war. They didn't organize for war, politically, militarily, anything. They were forced into this environment to preserve the ethnic Russian population of the Donbass. And how do we know they were looking for peace? Because they sat down in Istanbul willing to sign a peace agreement that said, just the Donbass, just Crimea, Ukraine, stay out of NATO, but everything will be okay. That is a huge step back from what they claimed they wanted, the special military operation, but Russia wasn't seeking to impose its will on anybody. They wanted peace, and they were denied. Were denied by the West, who always wanted war. This isn't about Boris Johnson deciding on the spur of the moment he's going to fly in and shut down the Istanbul Agreement. This is Boris Johnson implementing NATO policy to go to war against Russia. So that's where we are today.
So Russia was
Russia.
Go ahead, George.
Go ahead. So Russia was naive in 2014 and naive in 2024, because then you could just say, yeah, in 2024, they should have done what the Americans would have done in the same circumstances, shock and awe knock Ukraine out right away, just simply by, the overwhelming force. And suddenly, hey, we're facing Russia. We have to sue for peace right away. So the Russians were naive.
Putin acknowledges
Excuse me,
this.
everybody. George said 2024. He meant 2022. Sorry.
Right.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I meant February. It's a shorthand. February.
I don't want you to think that you have a secret earplug from the Kremlin.
February 24. Yeah, of this year. Yes, exactly. That's how I said.
But I do. Remember, I'm a Putin puppet, so I got the secret microphone. No, look, Vladimir Putin has acknowledged that he was naive in 2014.
Yep.
He said, if I were to do it again, I should have finished the mission then. We should have just wiped the Ukrainians out, solved this problem, and moved on. But I believed in peace. I believed Merkel. I believed Holland. I don't know if he believed the Ukrainians, but he believed the Europeans would get the Ukrainians to do this. And they spent 8 years sacrificing 14,000 lives, by the way, both Ukrainian and ethnic Russians, many of them military, but many of them civilian. But it's 14,000 lives nonetheless that shouldn't have been lost had Putin just finished this problem in 2014. So for all those people that say Vladimir Putin's a steely-eyed killer, hey, no, he's a pussycat. He's a guy who actually believes in peace, looks for peaceful outcomes, looks for peaceful solutions. And he was naive in 2014 to believe these people. And he was naive in 2024 to believe that Ukraine was willing to take the easy way out.
Yeah, but Scott, you raise a very important point and problem. George and I have talked at great length about Hollande, Merkel, Poroshenko, okay? And my original question to you, I'll rephrase it right now, how has this come to an end? With the caveat, well, there's nobody trustworthy to talk to, okay? They've shown themselves, they've shown their duplicity, they've shown their lies, okay? And now go back to where we want to start from the beginning.
Well, the reason why I brought all that up.
Fantastic preview, because I think it was, and you really put some bookends there. Go ahead.
But without knowing that, what I'm about to say wouldn't make any sense. Again, slow to harness, quick to ride. That's Russia. Now, I don't want Russians to get mad at me. I'm just quoting an old Russian proverb. But Russia has been struggling to get into the harness. And one of the key aspects of getting in the harness, it's several. One is to build the military capacity to accomplish this. Russia didn't have the military. I mean, I think every military analyst, including myself, is going, why are they entering such a big military problem with a peacetime military, force? Why didn't you mobilize the reserves early on, et cetera? And we now know the answer. Naive, totally naive. Slow to harness. They mobilized 300,000 reservists. In addition to that, there's ongoing recruitment. So the number is actually considerably larger than 300,000. There's 120,000 volunteers that have been mobilized during this period of time as well. In a sports analogy, when a team is preparing for a championship match, or when an athlete's preparing for the Olympics, talk to any Olympic athlete about their training plan, their regimen. They want peak performance to come time of the match. All right? Keep that in mind, because the military is the same way. You aren't going to mobilize, train, equip, and bring together this force, because the peak performance moment for the Russians is when that last battalion tactical group comes out of the training ground and arrives in the special military operation, falls in on its equipment, has the fuel, the ammunition all lined up. That's the moment when they have to be used. Because if you don't use them, if you instead sit them back, idle their engines, combat efficiency drops. And so in a very short period of time, that final BTG is going to arrive from the final training ground, wherever they are in Russia right now. And when they arrive, the Russians have had a long time. They're not surprised by any of this. They've been planning for this. They know when that unit arrives. They know what logistically has to be done to prepare for that. And they know what they want to accomplish with it. We are talking 10 to 15 division equivalents. The Russians have solidified the defensive line. It ain't going nowhere. They're continuing offensive operations in the Bakhmut area and other areas, grinding away. 10 to 15 division equivalents are about to arrive on the battlefield, equipped with the most modern equipment the Russian defense industry can give them. And when they do, they're going to be unleashed. And as General Zelenskyy said, we don't have anything to stop them. This war, gentlemen, is over. And the West knows it. There's not a single military analyst out there worth their salt who can speak unencumbered, because many of them are prisoners to their contracts with MSNBC, CNN, et cetera. So they have to spout the thing. But even then, they're starting to lose the narrative, because they're just in there going, there ain't nothing Ukraine can do. There's literally nothing Ukraine can do. This is over. And that's the important thing. The West still labors under the belief that there can be a negotiated settlement. And so now, George, I come to answer your question. I told you it takes me a little while to get there, but
you're like
Zelenskyy,
the Russians. Okay.
Slow to harness, baby. Quick to ride. Zelenskyy isn't dim. Zelenskyy wants to continue the fight, because that's the only thing that keeps Zelenskyy politically viable.
And maybe
at some point, well, we'll see. I mean, I personally believe that if Zelenskyy doesn't take the ride that he never really denied wanting, but at some point in time, he's going to be offered the ride. And if he refuses the ride, then I think he's going to die. And it isn't going to be the West killing him. It's going to be his own military, because they hate him. He's turning into a hateful figure. He's despised. The troops despise him. If you take him and instead of taking him to a hand-picked group of ultra-nationalists, which they did in the so-called Bakhmut visit, he takes him to the unit that just suffered 90% casualties, puts Zelenskyy, and he'll shoot him on the spot. They'll shoot him on the spot.
So why don't the Americans then push? If they really want a negotiated outcome, why don't they push for it? After all, as you said, Zelenskyy is a tool of the Americans. I mean, so he'll have to do as he's told. I mean, if Biden tells him the jig's up, then the jig's up. So why don't the Americans push for something? And the Russians would be very welcoming to any American initiatives, but there haven't been any American.
It would only have to come from Washington.
It has to come from Washington.
Yeah. Well, I disagree. I don't think Russia will take any initiative. I think it's over for diplomacy. I think the day of diplomacy is finished. I think the Russians are committed to a path of measured military advances. There will come a moment, and I think the United States knows this. I'll call it the Odessa moment. Prior to the Odessa moment, Russia is there's things that cannot be stopped with diplomacy. The first thing that can't be stopped is that Russia is going to reconquer every piece of territory that belongs to it under Article 64 of the Russian Constitution. I think I got the article right. But this newly acquired territory, there's significant parts of it that are still occupied by Ukraine. That is Mother Russia. It's never going to belong to Ukraine. And so when people say, what is Russia going to do offensively? I just told you what Russia is going to do offensively. They're going to liberate Mother Russia. And the liberation of Mother Russia isn't just the reacquisition or the acquisition of this territory. It's going to push the Ukrainians back, so never again can an M777 howitzer fire a round that lands on Mother Russia. They are going to be pushed back to a sufficient range outside of artillery range. This will probably require Russia in the north to take Kharkov and expand out. So I think Ukraine is going to lose yet another province. They're going to lose Kharkov. They may lose more. They may lose Sumy. I don't know. I'm not a Russian planner. But I think the major action is going to be fought in the north and in the center, pushing the Ukrainians back. This is going to be done decisively, but in a measured fashion. Why? Because what I get in talking to Russian officials is that one of the things the Russians have been doing from the very beginning is escalation management. The Russians don't want to win too fast, too quick. They don't want to shock NATO to the point that NATO does something precipitously, or a NATO member does something precipitously, such as Poland moving into Western Ukraine or Romania working with Moldova to attack Transnistria. These are two potential flashpoints that the Russians don't want to flash. And the way you don't let them flash is through measured success on the battlefield. Success that becomes inevitable, unstoppable. And now we come to what I call, and I think this is going to be reached sometime in the late spring, early summer. I call it the Odessa moment. Russia will have done everything I just said, and there's nothing Ukraine can do. nothing Ukraine or the West can do to stop it. Now we come to the Odessa moment, because this becomes a risky time for Russia, because I think they can do everything I just said without any risk. Now the Odessa moment is when they're going to burst out of the Kherson bridgehead, and they're going to make a drive towards Transnistria. But before that happens, and again, I'm guided by Putin. Strange that I would be guided by. I'm Putin's puppet, so I guess I have to be guided by him. But it was an answer he gave to a question at a Valdai meeting from a Hungarian journalist about Odessa, and he gave a response that was cryptic. But the general gist of the response was that Odessa can either be the point that creates peace or the point that terminates the conflict violently. Meaning that, and this is where diplomacy comes in, George. This is what I call the American moment. Everybody knows that if you deny Ukraine access to the sea, it's dead as a nation. It'll be nothing more than an agrarian rump state. Very difficult to sustain. And it's a problem for both Russia, and this is why it's so important. It's a problem for Russia and the West. This is why the Odessa moment is so critical, because Russia doesn't want Ukraine to be a dead nation.
That's right.
They don't want that. They don't. It's not good for Russia. But Russia also needs to protect its interests. So the Odessa moment will be that time for a diplomatic solution that allows Ukraine continued access to the sea, allows Ukraine, and Ukraine's making it tougher and tougher, taking down Catherine the Great statue, taking down all the statues. It's like, hey, go ahead and kill us. Why not? We're going to, as opposed to saying, no, we're going to respect the heritage of Odessa so that we can live in peace and prosperity with our, but the Russians have never taken the bait. Anytime anything stupid like this happens, including what happened in the disaster that happened in the School 19. Everybody's like, oh, Russia's going to respond. No, they're not. That's war, baby. You lost 96 guys. Get over it. The same day they lost 96 guys, they took out a ice skating rink where the Ukrainians lost hundreds of guys, including a HIMARS system, 2 Vampire systems, and some artillery systems. So it's called war. If you give the enemy a target, the enemy's going to hit the target. And shame on the Russian leadership that didn't predict this.
People are saying here. That's what people are saying.
But also say this. I mean, I don't want to deviate too much, but this is a story that was driven by a certain class of Russian blogger, I'll call it. And it's a class that seems to be dominated by people who fought in the Donbass in the early stages of the conflict. It was what I call the
this guy Igor Strelkov.
Yeah, a bunch of egomaniacs who went in there early when it was the Wild West, ran their own little fiefdoms, did their own thing, some of it legal, a lot of it illegal, a lot of it criminal. And as the war matured and adults came in and took over control because it became a long-term conflict that has sustainability issues attached to it, these people like Strelkov and others got pushed out. And since then, they've been very bitter, very angry. They're very anti-Putin. They're very anti-Russia. They claim to be part of this greater Russian empire thing. I don't know what but these guys hate Putin. They hate Russia. And in many cases, I don't know what they're trying to accomplish, because they seem to be literally tools of Ukrainian propaganda. And what you saw with this, the story, 600 dead, 600 dead. Putin should be shot. They should hang this man by his entrails on the thing. I mean, this story was ginned up by these people. It's a tragedy. There's Russian families right now who have lost fathers, lost husbands, lost sons. I mean, my God, if you don't cry when you think about this, you don't cry when you think about what's happening to the Ukrainians, except for the Nazis. I never cried. But for the average Ukrainian, man, you've got to break down in tears what's happening. This is just one of the.
Let's flesh this out. I'm very much intrigued by what you're saying here, this Odessa moment. So, are you saying that Russia would be amenable to, under certain circumstances, allowing Odessa to remain part of Ukraine as an outlet onto the sea? Are you suggesting that could be part of a settlement that Russia could buy into?
I'm suggesting that Putin suggested it.
Okay.
And when we think of diplomacy, understand this, there's no diplomatic intervention that can occur that's going to stop Russia from doing everything up to the Odessa moment. That is going to happen.
But you are very well aware that Odessa is a very, very delicate sore point with a lot of people in eastern Ukraine and in Russia because of the trade union massacre. Okay.
Absolutely.
There are people that want, it hasn't been that long. These people are still alive. They want accountability. I want to see a trial. It was all videotaped. We know exactly who did it. Okay.
Yeah. I'm not a Russian negotiator. All right. If I were, part of my deal would be accountability.
But you're absolutely right. I live here. I work with these people every single day for a quarter century. They are very reasonable people at the end of the day. If they're actually very, very pragmatic. I've met very few fanatics here, to be honest with you. But my big question is here, who's the interlocutor? I mean, why would the Kremlin trust anybody in the West and say, we want to look reasonable. Let's use Odessa. I don't see that coming out anymore from the Russian side.
I wonder though, one answer could be to that, what Scott just mentioned. There is always the danger that NATO is going to do something stupid, something that's reckless, and Russia wants to avoid that. And so there is at least an incentive on Russia's part not to provoke NATO into doing something crazy.
And let me bring up one other aspect too. Everything I just described in terms of the pre-Odessa moment military campaign can be handled by the current forces that have been mobilized by Russia, hands down, and be handled in a way that decisively destroys, eviscerates the Ukrainian military. But to move on into Odessa, you are repeating potentially some of the same mistakes you made earlier. You're now talking about moving in, creating huge frontages that has to be manned by forces that may not be sufficient to the task. Now, I think Russia could handle it if it's only Ukraine, but the Russians are no longer naive. If you move into Odessa, move up to Transnistria, and you create a Moldovan conflict where Ukraine in desperation attacks Transnistria, Moldova in an act of stupidity commits to support Ukraine, and Romania commits to support Moldova, where are the Russian troops going to come? They're going to handle that problem. And this is why I think the Odessa moment comes in. Peter, I'm not Russian, but I understand what you're saying. You live there, George. You guys know there's a lot of sentiment, a lot of emotion attached to this. But there are realists. It wasn't too long ago Russia got the snot kicked out of it in Kharkov because they were insufficiently manned and prepared for the offensive that hit. Russia's been escalating NATO's potential involvement and managing that escalation very successfully, to be honest, very successfully. They've humiliated NATO. They've destroyed NATO's equipment. They've destroyed the NATO proxy, and they're getting ready to crush them like the bugs they are. But there are two problem sets that will emerge here. One is Western Ukraine. I think Russia is handling the potential of a Western Ukrainian problem set with the group of Russian forces and your Belarus forces that have been formed up in Belarus. That is a deterrent against any precipitous Polish action, I believe. But there is no equivalent in the South. There's nothing there and this is the most dangerous flashpoint. And this is why I think the Odessa moment is so critical. Does that mean that Russia won't go into Odessa? Of course they will. Russia's not going to lose this war. Russia's not going to drag its feet. But that you suddenly took something that's very manageable and you've now created the potential for problems. And any military leader, any national leader worth their salt would say, can we resolve this potential problem, this conflict flashpoint diplomatically? And the West is so desperate for a diplomatic solution. I believe the Odessa moment is when Zelenskyy is going to be gone. I believe the Odessa moment's when a figure, and look at how the Russians are speaking about Zelenskyy. I despise that fat little potato chip eating person because he sat there and took a selfie with Bandera behind him. I mean, I know who he is. I know what he stands for. But what have the Russians been saying? He's a man of honor. We respect him as a military leader, and et cetera. What's that setting up? So that when you sit across the table from him, the Russian people may accept whatever outcome that comes from it. You can't negotiate.
But one of the biggest problems, and I think, George is one of the first to say it, I watch other podcasts and stuff like that. I like talking to you. I wish we could talk to McGregor. Like, very busy. But I mean, George brought up the point, and it's a salient point. I mean, any outcome is Russia will demand that it doesn't have to do this again in 5 years or 10 years. Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's the whole, that's the whole 9 yards right there. Okay. Because we can talk about, I think I was the first to say Ukraine is going to be, it's not what Ukraine is going, it's not what Moscow is going to control. At the end is what is Ukraine going to control? Okay. Mm-hmm. That was my addition to the conversation. And we can talk about, negotiations and all that. I mean, maybe I'm being too maximalist here, but for me, it is what are the terms and conditions of your surrender? That's how I look at it.
Correct. No, and I don't disagree. But now we come back to the Odessa moment. What do you think if the Ukrainians are confronted with extreme terms, and believe me, no peace settlement will successfully be reached without extreme terms. Denazification, demilitarization, no NATO, the whole works. Guarantees, as you said, that this isn't a 5-year repeating cycle, that this is one and done. We're not doing this again. This is a permanent piece. Part of, and remember, the Russian overall objective is a new European security framework. Exactly. You can't anchor a new European security framework on a cancerous tumor that's just going to keep metastasizing, okay? Ukraine has to excise. Right now, it is a tumor. It must be eliminated through radiation, chemo, surgery, whatever. It's got to go. But now, here's the question. How do you get the Ukrainians to accept such harsh terms? What can you put on the table that will get them to say, we have no choice? Now I'm going to tell you what the answer is. National survival. And I don't mean occupation of Kiev and all that. No. I mean, the only thing that makes Ukraine viable economically in the future is continued access to the sea. And you turn to the Ukrainians and the West and you say, this neutral Ukraine, because it will be neutral. This denazified Ukraine, because it will be denazified. This demilitarized Ukraine, because it will be demilitarized. Could either exist as a pathetic little agrarian rump state.
With access to the sea.
No, with no access to the sea. That's the pathetic little agrarian rump state. Or as a nation capable of possessing a thriving economy that can contribute to Europe and the world through continued access to the sea. You'll have a choice. And I think that's the choice that Russia's going to put on the table at the Odessa moment. And I'll also tell you my personal opinion. That offer isn't going to stay on the table very long. Because again, you don't take athletes who are ready to run the race and tell them, nah, just sit down here for about a week, let your muscles atrophy, you'll pull your hand, while we let Russia already, remember, Putin, George, we come back. Putin may have been naive, but I challenge anybody to tell me that Putin's stupid. Putin ain't stupid, all right? Fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice, won't get fooled again. Putin is going to have that moment coming up. He already told the West in December of 2021 that here are draft treaties. And he said, you must read them and come back to me. All right, but you have to read them and come back to me, and it's not going to drag out forever. It needs to be in a short period of time. He was ignored. All right? He's not stupid. He's not going to play that game again. This isn't, this isn't Groundhog Day for Putin. He learned his lesson.
Scott, I really have to impress upon people. The Russian people won't accept it either. That element is forgotten so much, okay? Because young Russian boys are being killed, okay?
Yeah.
And it is something that is very visceral here. The support for this military operation is still high, and people believe that they have to be diligent and keep the course going. But any kind of settlement, I'm very wary to use the word peace, but a settlement, public opinion is going to weigh heavily, because the cost has already been too high. Losing one person is high for a lot of people. I mean, this whole BS, Russians are ruthless. They don't care about their own people.
Well, they care.
Completely wrong.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and just keep this in mind too. This offensive that we're talking about, that Russia's going to win decisively, they're going to lose thousands of men. Okay? The Ukrainians aren't going to roll over. Ukrainians are going to fight. This is going to be bloody. This is going to be visceral. This is going to be horrific. Russia's going to lose thousands of men to achieve this victory. But now comes the important point about the Odessa moment. The reason why I think there has to be an Odessa moment is that if Russia carries out these offensive operations that I believe they're going to focus on, seizing the north, securing the center, it's going to be humiliating for NATO. It's going to be just absolutely devastating for NATO.
Good.
And if Russia just rolled immediately in and went down to Odessa, that could shock a NATO reaction. There has to be a pause. The pause exists for NATO to be offered an out. They have to be offered an out. And the second you do that, you deflate the intervention bubble. We have an out. Do I think Russia is going to, first of all, I don't think NATO is going to be able to get Ukraine to do anything quick enough for this offer to reach fruition. Do I think that Odessa at the end of this is going to be Ukrainian? No. But I think Russia has to, with all sincerity, offer that pause, that opportunity for diplomatic intervention as part of their escalation management. You must deflate the intervention before you go in. And here's the thing. When Odessa is taken off the map, this ain't going to be a battle that lasts very long. Russia is going to roll through decisively, get to Transnistria, and confront NATO with a fait accompli. They may, in order to do this, they may surround Odessa because I don't think Russia wants to get involved in street-to-street fighting in Odessa. But I also think that leading up to this fight, the Ukrainian army is going to be destroyed. And I think that when the time comes, Odessa is going to collapse from within as much as from without, because there is a significant Russian population there. There is a significant population that's becoming dissatisfied with the Ukrainian government. And if a genuine offer was put on the table for a peaceful resolution, the Ukrainian government, NATO dismissed it, I think the population will be ready for
it. Scott, it's interesting here. I mean, much of what you're saying, I absolutely agree with you. Let's say your scenario is being played out. We could have a military coup in Kiev. I mean, Zelenskyy and his mafia crowd are out. What are the chances in your mind, thinking about giving NATO an off-ramp, is that NATO countries would recognize the coup government, and that would be a way for them to say, this government is gone. We have to have a semblance of order in Ukraine. We recognize them, and the reason for the coup would, of course, be that Ukraine has to settle. Do you think that would be an off-ramp for NATO, where they would say we have to recognize this government because we have to have a government in Ukraine to be able to work with?
Well, I think that's a precondition for the Odessa moment. Because Zelenskyy can't be part of the Odessa.
Well, he's not part of it. No.
But I think the coup will actually take place before the Odessa moment. I think when Russia, look, maybe I'm smoking dope. I don't know. I shouldn't have done all that cocaine last night. My brain's not working properly.
So you were hanging out with the Ukrainian president, huh?
Yeah, okay. But if I'm wrong about Russia's capability or Russia's intent, and they slow roll this thing and they don't have a decisive victory, that changes the whole picture. Because the longer this drags on, the less likely it is for Russian victory. 300,000 troops looks really good until it doesn't look really good. And it stops looking good when this becomes a long, dragged out affair. Casualties start to be taken. And you lose the shock value of the initial arrival. I mean, military is all about momentum, and the Russians have the ability to achieve decisive momentum and carry that momentum through. But if they slow roll this thing, if they I don't know if I can say that word, half bake it, I can say half bake this, then it's over. Russia's going to lose. Not lose in terms of defeat, but lose by there's going to be this Ukrainian cancer. And ultimately, at the end of the day, the Ukrainian cancer has to be excised. This is why I believe that Russia has, this 300,000 men is so important, that when the remaining 10 to 15 divisions worth come in, that Russia is going to carry out decisive military operations to achieve the objectives that I've outlined, and they're going to set themselves up for
But Scott, 300,000 isn't really such a huge number. I mean, if we talk, like, if you recall the Second World War, you were talking about millions upon millions of men being thrown into battle. So 300,000, that's a small, it sounds like a lot on paper, but when you're talking about major military operations, 300,000 isn't such an enormous amount.
Well, but it is when if you take a look right now, the front lines have been stabilized, but they've only been stabilized by the Ukrainians throwing in their reserves. All right. The Russians are about to change the equation. It's not that Russia's pulling 300,000 men out of the front lines. They're bringing in, 150,000 fresh troops who are going to now be maneuvering. Russia drove on Kiev with 40,000 troops. They drove on Sumy with 30,000 troops. We're talking 150, 175, 200,000 troops now. The range of options, the depth that will be able to achieve, the speed, and there's nobody in Ukraine to stop them. There is no Ukrainian army left to stop them. And so I think we're looking at, the Ukrainians have made the same mistake in Kharkov that the Russians made. They got no defense in depth. It's an overinflated balloon. And the Russians, I believe, are just going to come in and rapidly take all that. There will be no defense. The Ukrainians are going to collapse. And when they collapse in the north, they collapse in the center, because now Russia comes down and sweeps out that. The key is, of course, to break the Ukrainian defenses in Bakhmut. I think that's being accomplished as we speak. But if the Russians sweep in, seize the north, seize Kharkov, and then move down, sweeping all the way down through Kherson on the Nikolaev, and then stop. Now that's your move. This can be done with.
What about securing the western border? In other words, to prevent any further arms going into Ukraine?
That's a bridge too far. Russia doesn't have the troops for that. The troops could intervene.
That's I was going to ask it. I don't want to put you on the spot or anything like that, but that was one thing that McGregor was bringing up. He's a big proponent of that strategy. Can you explain why it's a bridge too far? For those that watch all of these podcasts, go ahead.
Well, I mean, first of all, let's just measure the border. It's a big border from the Belarus-Poland border. You get into, the different countries. I think Slovakia that has a shared border with them. Hungary. Then you get to the Romanian border. Transnistria, Moldova. You're going to secure that border?
Well, I guess asked differently. Maybe it's much to do about nothing. The continued inflow of weaponry from NATO weaponry into Ukraine, is that a game changer, or is it just
no? Is it a game changer? Yeah, the game changed. It's not a game winner.
No, in Ukraine's favor. Okay.
No, it changed the game, but to Ukraine's detriment, because Russia has adapted to it right now, and whatever weaponry is being brought in is not changing the outcome on the battlefield. And the Ukrainians are left with an extraordinarily tenuous logistics line that's going to become even more tenuous as the battle unfolds, chaos ensues, etc. Communications degrade. It's again, the Russians. I think the day of the special military operation is over. The day of the Russians doing it half-baked is over. I think doctrine's coming out. Bam! They're opening up the book, and it's going to be jam comms, do this, do that, strike logistics, all the preparatory work that the Russians know has to be done to support a military operation will be done. And the Ukrainians have been living high on the hog with this artificial sense of accomplishment, because they've been allowed to communicate. They've been allowed to communicate. That is just a stunning thing that they can actually talk. They've been allowed to move. Again, things that should be denied them. Think of this. The Iraqis had, a very large and capable military in 2003. But they had tank divisions, armored brigades that would try to move into contact with the American forces. They had an extensive air defense system. When those brigades moved, they died. They never made it. There was never a major force-on-force confrontation. I forget what they call it, a movement to contact, where the two forces meet each other and they shape the battlefield. The classic thing that didn't happen because as the Iraqis moved, they were decimated, destroyed. I'm here to tell you right now, I believe in the next phase of this conflict, when the Ukrainians decide to move, it's going to be game, set, match over. Ukrainians are dug in. If they did get dug in, the artillery is going to take them out. If they get up and try to move, they're going to die. And that's just it. Russia knows how to play this game. It's not like they have to be retrained. They know how to do it. They've been spending every day since September preparing for this very moment. It's going to get ugly. But now we come down to this. To secure the border, how many troops do you need? Because remember, the lesson from Kharkov isn't just forward defense, but a defense in depth to prevent penetration. They're going to need 500, 700,000 troops to do that they don't have. But here's the better way to defend Western Ukraine. Wait for the enemy to commit. You see, if Poland wants to take Western Ukraine, Poland has to project power into Western Ukraine. The moment they do that, they've defined the battlefield. So let's say Poland comes in with 90,000 troops, and they move and they advance on Lvov. First of all, we now have a well-identified line of communication that Poland needs to secure to retain, logistic sustainability. Russia will interdict that line of communication. The Polish troops are now isolated. They will now be hit, struck, and the Russian troops don't have to worry about securing the entire border. They can come in and concentrate on the defeat of these 90,000 troops. That's what you do with the group of forces up in Belarus. You react to the enemy attack the way Russia is always prepared for this conflict. To receive the attack and then to counterattack. What Russia's not going to do, and what they can't do, which they don't have the force structure to do, is secure that damn border. That's a bridge too far. That border can't be secured with the force.
And of course, we would have a very hostile population also there. Okay.
Yeah, and remember, you're talking about securing it pre-political, political settlement, pre-denazification. The only way you're going to denazify Western Ukraine is for Ukraine to reach the decision that it has to be denazified. Denazification has to be done by Ukraine, whatever Ukraine's going to look like, whether it be the Zelenskyy-led government, a Klitschko-led government. I don't think either one of them are viable, or something new. They're going to have to make the decision. And I don't think that it's going to be a Russian-appointed leader, to be honest with you. Because that would be self-defeating.
That would be wise. That would be wise.
Just going back to the Odessa moment now, do you mean that what the Russians will say to NATO is that if you want Odessa to remain as part of Ukraine, you need to settle now? Is that going to be the Russian ultimatum, basically, that this, if you want a settlement, then and you basically you're going to keep Odessa?
And that means neutrality, no NATO, right. No NATO.
Right.
Otherwise, you lose Odessa. In other words, is that going to be what the Russians will turn to?
I believe so, because let's set that up for a second. If you take a look at this grain deal that's been going on, and we talk about the importance of Ukrainian wheat to global food supplies, et cetera. Ukrainian and Russian wheat. I mean, but the point is that Ukrainian wheat does play a factor in global food supply chains. The only thing that makes that viable is an outlet to the sea. And so the world knows the importance of Odessa. The world also knows the importance of historically, the importance of Odessa as a transit point of non-food related, commerce. So you don't have to convince anybody in the West about the importance of Odessa. They know it. They don't have to be educated on this point. They're aware of it. So it's not a hard selling point to for Russia to NATO. Here's the other thing that's being set up. You already have heard many NATO members, including the Secretary General, saying that no matter what, Ukraine can't be a member of NATO for a long time. It's so ridiculous that it should be even taken off the table. So NATO's already taken Ukrainian membership in NATO off the table. It's done. They're not going to fight for that. I think NATO today would buy into instantly a neutral Ukraine. So I just, and then here's the $1 trillion question. How does Ukraine recover? How does Ukraine recover from this? Who's going to pay for the $1 trillion of damage? It ain't going to be Russia. That's just clear and simple.
Well, one small caveat I think is very important, Scott, and I keep reminding people of this. The Ukrainian electricity grid is Soviet/Russian made, and they're the only ones that can fix it. Okay, I personally believe, I have no evidence of this, but I personally believe what's famously called the substations, Russia has that technology, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's producing it and storing it, because that's going to be key to get the electricity grid back on track.
I agree, but nobody
in the West can fix that.
Right, but Russia's number one priority isn't going to be fixing the electrical supply for Lvov.
No,
it's going to be fixing it for Kherson, for Mariupol, for Kharkov when they take Kharkov.
Again, one of the things I like to stress is that, and I think you've already mentioned it, is that Russia doesn't want a failed state on its border. No,
they don't. But Russia also, look, here's another part. Again, gosh, I'm starting to pretend that I'm a Russian diplomat. I'm not. I don't know.
You're doing a great job. They should hire you.
But you have to create an incentive for the West. I mean, how do you get the West? Because what you don't want is a victory where the West walks away from Ukraine. Because if that happens, then you have a failed state. Ukraine's going to need Western investment. And so there has to be incentives for Western investment in Ukraine. And the Russians are going to have to build through negotiations that incentive. I don't know how they're going to do that, but I like I never thought about that. I like that idea of Russia, taking the lead in the reconstitution of electrical grids because they're positioned to do that. You're going to need some sort of joint economic recovery commission between Russia, Ukraine, and the West that will seek to rebuild this. Because if there's any lesson anybody should know from European history, is the failure of Versailles and what it did to Weimar Germany. You don't want to have this festering failed state in the center of Europe, because that's just the disease migrates.
And with all of the arms flowing freely, also.
Well, I actually think Russia's going to get, when the final calculation's done, I think Russia's going to have an arsenal of around $50 billion worth of brand new Western military equipment.
I wonder if they'll get, I was asked about the Patriot battery, and I just said, the Russians they won't destroy it. They'll capture it. Okay. They'd be very curious to see it.
They'll capture parts of it. I mean, I think they'll, again, I think the Patriot's an overhyped system. I think it's too complex.
Right. What about, the other aspect you mentioned about the Odessa moment is, suppose the Russians take Odessa, would that possibly provoke NATO intervention? Because that's still not it can't be ruled out that NATO would get directly involved. Would Russian seizure of Odessa provoke NATO?
Again, I'm not a Russian military planner, so I can't pretend to know what these guys know. What I will say is this: the likelihood of NATO intervention increases exponentially by the size of the vacuum that exists in southern Ukraine. So if the Russian military assault is done in a manner that sustains a southern Ukrainian battle space free of Russian troops, the temptation for NATO or Romania or Moldova to enter that vacuum increases. So this is why I believe, again, I'm not a Russian military player, but if I were, I would not get bogged down in street-to-street fighting in Odessa. I would turn Odessa over to the Russian security services and turn this into a counterintelligence, counterinsurgency moment, trying to get civilians to rise up and all that. I would bypass Odessa and I would sprint to the damn border to eliminate this vacuum. I would ensure that the only way NATO intervenes in southern Ukraine is through direct contact with Russian troops, and NATO will never do that. NATO will come in. Go ahead.
I'm not so worried about a NATO intervention because I don't really know what that means other than nuclear weapons, which I hope that's still considered unthinkable. With their they've depleted their militaries. I mean, they're I think it was Moon of Alabama said at the start, the Germans had 200 tanks and only 12 of them worked. And I'm not really worried about a conventional intervention. I do worry about the doomsday, okay, because that's the only thing. Yeah. And prove me wrong, but I'm not afraid of NATO conventionally. I'm only worried about.
Right. No, I don't think it would be conventional. I bet a NATO intervention would, I think, involve long-range missiles. I mean, I think that's the only thing that's feasible.
But George, then they're on the chessboard, and Russia's run out of missiles apparently. Well, apparently not. Okay.
Well, let me put it this way:
country, it's going to be targeted like that.
If I'm a NATO military planner, I have to think past D-Day +1. All right. And I've been through this process before during Desert Storm. We spend a heck of a lot of time planning the initial attacks. We're going to put this many cruise missiles here, bombs here. All right. But the real military planner says, I'll leave that to the amateurs. What's going to happen D+2, D+3, D+4, D+5? What happens when the battle damage assessment reports come back in and we've missed 60% of the targets? They now have to be restruck, but we've initiated a process on the battlefield that has more emerging targets coming up. Do I have the capacity to continue to suppress the desired targets and deal with the emerging targets? How many weapons do I have? Do I have sufficient cruise missile capacity? If not, do I have sufficient bombs? Do I have bombs capable of the task, penetrating bombs, etc.? These are questions that any military professional will be asking. So now I'm a NATO military planner sitting in Brussels. I'm going, dude, this war is over at D+3 because we run out of ammunition. All right. The target deck, long-range missiles to do what? Because if you're not saturating Russia with long-range missiles, it's over. Because Russia ain't going to take one on the chin and sit back there and go, what did you do? Russia takes one on the chin and Brussels disappears, not in nuclear. See, I don't think Russia's going to respond nuclear unless they're attacked nuclear. But Russia has missile systems that will turn NATO headquarters into a smoking hole in the ground. They will turn Ramstein into a smoking hole in the ground. They will make London pay. They will make everybody pay. And I'm a NATO planner, and I don't want that to happen because now we have escalation that leads to the potential of real nuclear conflict. So now I'm sitting here saying, guys, we ain't doing this. We can't do it. If Russia attacks us, then we have to defend and all that. But for us to initiate this action against Russia is 100% suicide. See, I don't think the problem is missiles. My biggest fear is some stupid Romanian politician who believes that they can, that they somehow that NATO's Article 4, Article 5 will give them a shield to intervene in Moldova. You see, once a Romanian force is crossing to Moldova, they're not protected by anything, unless NATO under Article 4 authorizes.
It's been talked about, and I think George and I have touched upon this too. I mean, but you could use the Polish intervention and Romanian one and flip it and just say, well, let the Romanians worry about that. Let the Poles worry about that. Okay, I mean it creates its own dynamic and problem on the conflict. I mean, unless the Poles are considered an offensive force. I mean, they could go into Western Ukraine and say, well, these are historic Polish lands after all. Okay, and we're just protecting our brethren.
The Belarusians,
and because Russia is not necessarily interested in that. Okay, I mean,
but Lukashenko is.
I'm sorry.
Lukashenko is.
That's a good point.
And he counts.
That's a good
and
point.
Lukashenko has made it clear that a red line for Belarus will be Polish intervention in Ukraine, that he will not allow the Poles to take control of the Ukrainian border with Belarus, that is a security risk to Belarus. It's unacceptable. And therefore, any Polish intervention will trigger an immediate Belarus intervention. And because of the close ties between Russia and Belarus now, where they are a joint operating thing, I think Russia's bought into that. And so
you don't think the Russians have a veto on that?
Well, I mean, of course, Russia has a veto on that, but I don't think I don't think Russia would want to veto it.
Okay.
I don't think Russia's looking for a fight, but
well, the containing it and keeping NATO out obviously is the first option that Russia would want to pursue.
Right, and I think it's still, I think Russia has all along been quite concerned about NATO military intervention. I don't think that they've ever dismissed it and said, "Oh, this is out of the question." Yeah. And I don't mean just some crazy Pole and crazy Romanian. I think by NATO intervention they mean at the highest levels, which is the United States. And I think that's always a possibility that something or other could trigger it. I mean, Americans often act impetuously. It's not always thought out very clearly. Oh no, we can't possibly do that. We wouldn't be here in this mess if Americans they thought things out very carefully.
And plus, I mean, we have to go back to the political side of this. I mean, what really I find probably most concerning outside of the death and destruction is how people and the elites have bought into this. I mean, they don't take humiliation very well, okay? And that's what's really terrifying for me. I mean, 99.9% of what Scott has said, I'm completely on board with, and I've learned a lot from this conversation here. But these people, they're blinded by all ideology and hatred. Facts, damn the facts. They're not interested in it. We wouldn't be talking right now if they had the remotest interest in facts.
But again, Peter and George, I believe, and I've said this, Russia has been overly focused on escalation management because, as George pointed out, they are very worried about NATO intervention. That's something they don't want to have happen. The Russians have been overly paranoid about NATO offensive potential and desires. I don't believe NATO has offensive military aspirations against Russia. I personally don't believe it. Because they can't do it. That's just a fact, and they're not suicidal. The Americans, yes, they make stupid decisions. Remember, this is a stupid decision that involved Ukrainians dying for Ukraine. It didn't involve Americans dying for Ukraine. And you can talk about the 101st Airborne all you want. At the end of the day, they're a bunch of light infantry that go around on helicopters. There's survivability in a modern
battlefield. It makes the headline at antiwar.com, the top story.
Yeah. And so, yes, the Americans do have some heavy armored brigades that are deploying into Poland. But at best, when you put the two armored brigades with a striker, you get a division, an American division, which by itself is nothing, has no survivability, no sustainability. Remember, it's not just about what they do on day one. What they do on day two when they start to run out of fuel and ammunition, what they do on day three when they don't have the service depots in the back to pull the tanks, pull the engines and fix them because the M1 tank burns out very rapidly. They don't have a reserve division to pass through their lines and secure the front while they fall back and reorganize and re-equip. They're going to be on their own with no sustainability, no support, and they're going to die. Everybody knows this. So I don't see anybody in NATO going, we're going all the way. We're going all the way to Moscow. Moscow or die. No, there's no one doing that. There might be some Poles doing that after they, okay, let's go. But they'll die, halfway to Lvov. But the Russians, you're right, George, the Russians, they have to be worried about, and they are. This is why every one of them talks about escalation management. And this, again, is why I believe something like the Odessa moment is going to have to occur, because it's the most important element of escalation management, that Russia can't confront NATO with the inevitability of Russia getting everything at once, because then NATO could panic. And I think Russia's worried about a panic NATO. So I think Russia is going to set up the Odessa moment. Could be the Kharkov moment. Maybe they'll take Odessa first and whatever. They're going to set something up that creates a window of diplomatic opportunity. And whether the West takes it or not, that's on the West.
The most fascinating thing about your saying, I think I really, really find this insightful, is that the three of us and our viewers could interpret your strategy as being magnanimous. But do you think anybody in the West can recognize such a thing? I mean, I think your strategy here is quite brilliant. I mean, and no one else is talking this way. Oh, Ukrainians will, they're motivated. They will soldier on. I mean, I read all this garbage all of the time. But this is a magnanimous stratagem. But do you think anyone in the West can even recognize that as such?
Well, no. I mean, two things. One, I don't view it as diplomacy is the art of compromise. So I don't call it magnanimous. I just call it sound diplomacy. And plus, remember, it's also a selfish strategy, because the ultimate Russian objective isn't to be nice to the West. The ultimate Russian objective is to ensure, as you guys said, they don't do this every 5 years. The ultimate Russian objective is to create the condition for a European security framework.
Well,
remember,
okay, let me ask the question in a different way. If they even said, we have the Odessa Compromise, let's say Lavrov comes out with it, would that be interpreted as weakness? And the reason they're weak, we have to keep going. You see what I'm getting at?
No, I get, and now we come to the flip of the coin. I think we can soundly articulate a Russian perspective, because the Russians are rational players, pragmatic players, etc. And the Russians also, I think I can safely say this without fear of contradiction, the Russia knows the West pretty good. They have a great diplomatic service that has been studying the West. They can write nice sound papers on it. I know, look, you can pull up certain people and certain papers that are just ridiculous, but that exists anywhere. I think generally the theme is, though, of one of pragmatism, realism, etc. Unfortunately, we can't say that about the West. Probably the most pragmatic person out there when it comes to Russia is William Burns, the CIA director, former ambassador. But even he, again, I haven't spoken to him private, so I can't sit here and say I know what William Burns believes. But he has had to alter in his public face statements about Russia that betray what I believe is his sound academic comprehension of the reality of Russia. He says things that are consistent with what anybody who knew Russia would say, but I think that's more politics. But the reason why he has to say that is, and I think I've mentioned this to you before, I call them the Putin whisperers, this new class of academics that emerged after the collapse of the Soviet Union, people who no longer sought to understand Russia or the Soviet Union, but how to dominate Russia and how to exploit. They're a class of exploiters. Michael McFaul, first amongst them all. People who are ignorant as the day is long about the reality of Russia, who sought to recreate Russia, through the vehicle of Boris Yeltsin, designed to suppress Russia, weaken it economically, weaken it politically, et cetera, et cetera. These people have risen into prominence in the 90s, and then they have been shaped by the betrayal of Putin. You see, Putin didn't play the game. Putin didn't come in and say, I'm just going to be Yeltsin too. Putin said, no, red line, done. We're rebuilding Russia. We're standing up on our 2 feet. And they said they couldn't handle it. And they don't know how to handle Putin. So they do it the way all ignorant people do. They oversimplify it. They turn him into an autocrat, a dictator. They personify him, a cult of personality. And if you take a look, and I've done this, I mean, I've gone through this exercise, pull all of these idiots out there, the Putin whisperers, that have been in power for so long, and trace their academic roots back to their PhD theses. Every single one of them wrote a PhD thesis on the autocratic, dictatorial reality of Vladimir Putin.
And how to bring democracy to Russia.
Yeah, and so
but that's it. That's what McFaul does. I mean, they dream of a restoration of Yeltsin. I mean, that's what I mean. He does this explicitly, saying, "Hey, well, after Putin, we're going to go back to and there's certain historic analogies. Hey, after Stalin, we didn't get another Stalin. We got Khrushchev, and then again, after Brezhnev, we didn't get another Brezhnev. We got Gorbachev. So I think that's their view. So after Putin, we're not going to get another Putin. We're going to get going to go back to Yeltsin. I think that's wrong, but that's the way they think.
Right, but the reason why I brought this up is that
something that George and I have talked about recently is that because there's such a lack of knowledge of Russia and Russian history, is that the fulcrum, the prism to understand everything Russia is Stalin. Everything goes through that prism. It's amazing, and it is so short-sighted and so ridiculous. It's a ridiculous exercise, but that seems to be the default all the time. It's amazing.
It is 100% the default. But here's the problem, because the initiating question here dealt with, will the West view Russian the diplomatic initiative as weakness, as magnanimous? How will they interpret it? And the point is, they have no intellectual capacity to properly interpret what Russia's doing. So here comes, here's the ultimate challenge to the United States and to Joe Biden. When the time comes, sometimes you need to bring in fresh blood. Sometimes you need to bring in fresh advisors. Sometimes you have to recognize that the people who have been advising you are wrong. You know who did that? Ronald Reagan, when it came to disarmament. When Ronald Reagan made the decision to sign the INF Treaty, to head down that direction, which was a sharp departure from all previous talk about arms control, et cetera, he had to jettison people like Richard Pearl and people, the hardliners that refused to play this game, got jettisoned because the critical moment came up. And I believe that the Odessa moment could be of such significance because, believe me, if it does occur, if there is an Odessa moment, it is going to be of historical. It is. I mean, historians hundreds of years from now will be talking about this because it is a pivotal moment in the history of Europe, the trajectory of Europe, the trajectory of NATO, U.S.-European relations, Russian relations with Europe, relations with there. It all comes down to that moment, and hopefully there will be somebody around Biden that goes, fire Jake Sullivan. And because Jake Sullivan's going to be doing this, and he's going to go, Jake, take a seat. Sammy Smith, come in, sit down. You're my new Russia guy. Tell me what's going on. That's going to have to happen, or else the U.S. is going to, even if the Odessa moment occurs, the U.S. is going to be dealing with an alternative reality where Michael McFaul gets to go on TV and spin this, any which way but Sunday. And then that doesn't impact what Russia has accomplished at the moment, but it does impact how the world will respond to it. Because if the Odessa moment can't succeed unless mechanisms are put in place to prevent this from happening again.
Yes, but Scott, the big problem with relieving Jake Sullivan is that he's replaced by Victoria Nuland.
No, she'd have to go too. I mean, I'm talking about new blood.
Of course. Yeah. Victoria Nuland is, the point person. But anyway, Scott, thank you so much for
fascinating
your time, particularly as you're obviously not in the best of health. So thank you so much for manfully braving this and a lot
And
of very
robustly.
interesting- yeah, robustly, yes, exactly. So thank you. We've learned a great deal. It was a very, very interesting, fascinating conversation, and we will be doing this again very shortly. So thank you. And remember, if you like the Gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye.